In this video, we'll review Chapter 26, The Great West and the Agricultural Revolution. The clash of cultures on the plains was continuing as the settlers moved west, so clashes between Indians and the advancing white pioneers would lead to further migration and conflict. The Comanches drove the Apaches off the Central Plains into the upper Rio Grande Valley in the 18th century. Harried by Mandans and Chippewas, the Cheyenne had abandoned villages along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers a century before the Civil War. The Sioux were displaced from the Great Lakes woodlands in the 18th century and emerged onto the plains to prey upon the Crows, the Kiowas, and the Pawnees. White soldiers and settlers on the plains accelerated the fateful cycle of fierce enmities among Indians and ultimately undermined the foundations of Native American culture. They spread cholera, typhoid, and smallpox among native peoples of the plains with devastating results, and they put pressure on steadily shrinking bison populations by hunting and by grazing on their livestock in the prairie grasses, or grazing their livestock on the prairie grasses. This is a picture called The Buffalo Hunt by Frederick Remington. The federal government tried to pacify the Plains Indians by signing treaties with chiefs of various tribes at Fort Laramie in 1851 and Fort Atkinson in 1853, but the treaties marked beginnings of the reservation system in the West. They established boundaries for territory for each tribe. They attempted to separate Indians into great colonies to the north and south of a corridor of intended white settlement, and the white treaty makers misunderstood, though, both Indian government and Indian society. The tribes and chiefs were often fictions of white imagination, and many Native Americans recognized only the authority of their immediate families or a band elder. The nomadic culture of the Plains Indians was utterly alien to the concept of living out one's life in confinement of a defined territory. And in the 1860s, the federal government intensified the policy and herded the Indians into still smaller confines, principally the Great Sioux Reservation in the Dakota Territory and Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma. Indians surrendered their ancestral lands when they received the solemn promises from Washington that they would be left alone and they would be provided food, clothing, and other supplies. Regretfully, federal Indian agents were often very corrupt, and for more than a decade after the Civil War, there was fierce warfare between the Indians and U.S. Army that raged in various parts of the West, and many Army troops were immigrants. Fully 1/5 of all U.S. Army personnel were African American, dubbed Buffalo Soldiers by the Indians. This is a picture of the Pawnee Indians in front of their lodge in 1868. This is in central Nebraska, and they regarded the United States as an ally in their own struggles against the marauding Sioux. The Indian wars in the West were often savage clashes. At Sand Creek, Colorado, Colonel J.M. Chivington's militia massacred 400 Indians. Women were shot, praying for mercy. Children had their brains dashed out, and braves were tortured, scalped, and mutilated. Cruelty begot cruelty. Federman's Annihilation in 1866 was a violent slaughter of 81 whites by the Sioux. This is a map showing the Indian Wars from 1860 to 1890. The Federman Massacre led to one of the few, though short-lived, Indian triumphs in the Plains Wars, and this was the Battle of Little Bighorn. After the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, the government had abandoned the Bozeman Trail, and the Great Sioux Reservation had been guaranteed to the Sioux tribes. In 1874, another round of warfare happened with the Plains Indians. General Custer led a scientific expedition into the Black Hills in South Dakota and announced that he had found gold there. Hordes of greedy gold seekers swarmed onto Sioux lands. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians took to the warpath, inspired by the words of Sitting Bull. General Custer led the 7th Cavalry out and set out to suppress the Indians and to return them to the reservation. He attacked 2,500 well-armed warriors along the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana. He was the white chief with yellow hair, and his 250 officers and men were completely wiped out at the battle in 1876. The Indian victory was short-lived, and the army ended up hunting down Indians who had humiliated and killed Custer and his cavalry. In 1877, a band of Nez Perce Indians in northeastern Oregon were goaded into flight when the U.S. authorities tried to herd them onto a reservation. Chief Joseph surrendered with his 700 Indians after a torturous 1,700-mile, 3-month trek across the Continental Divide towards Canada. The Nez Perce sent were sent to the Dusty Reservation of Kansas, where 40% of them died of disease. Survivors eventually were allowed to return to Idaho. The fierce Apache tribes of Arizona and New Mexico were led by Geronimo, and they were the most difficult to subdue. They were pursued into Mexico by U.S. troops. Federal troops used sun-flashing heliography, a communication device that impressed the Indians as big medicine. The scattered remnants of the warriors finally were persuaded to surrender after Apache women were exiled to Florida, and the Apaches ultimately became successful farmers in Oklahoma, which was back during that time period Indian territory. The relentless fire and sword policy of the whites at last had shattered the spirit of the Indians. The vanquished Indians were ghettoized on reservations, and they were compelled to the sullen existence as wards of the government. Taming of the Indians was engineered by the federal government's willingness to back its land claims with military force. The railroad, which shot an iron arrow through the heart of the West, and locomotives, who could transport unlimited numbers of troops, farmers, cattlemen, sheep herders, and settlers, gave the government a big advantage. Indians were ravaged by white people's diseases, to which they still had little resistance, and by firewater, which they could resist even less. The virtual extermination of the buffalo doomed the Plains Indians' nomadic way of life. This is a picture of the Battle of Little Bighorn by Amos Badheart Bull, and this is the battle where an Oglala Sioux tribal historian and artist shows Crazy Horse, who was in war paint, firing on a trooper of Custer's 7th Cavalry. All of the soldiers were wiped out. The buffalo had initially been in a population of tens of millions, and they were described as hunchback cows. They blackened the western prairies when white Americans first arrived. The shaggy animals were the staff of life for Native Americans. Their flesh provided food, their hides provided clothes, lariats, and harnesses, and their dried dung provided buffalo chips to start fires. When the Civil War ended, 15 million of these meaty beefs still grazed on the western plains. This is a picture of Geronimo, who was also known by his Apache name, Goahakila. The effect of the railroads had sometimes you had to wait up to 8 hours for a herd of buffalo to cross the tracks. Much of the food supply for the railroad construction gangs came from buffalo steaks, and William Buffalo Bill Cody killed over 4,000 animals in 18 months while employed by the Kansas Pacific Railroad. With the building of the railroad, the massacre of the herds began in earnest. Creatures were slain for hides, for tongues, and for amusement. Sportsmen on trains leaned out windows and blazed away at the animals. The wholesale butchery left fewer than 1,000 buffalo alive by 1885. Once numerous beasts were in danger of complete extinction. This is a shocking example of greed and waste that accompanied the conquest of the continent by the white settlers. By the 1880s, the national conscience began to stir uneasily over the plight of the Indians. Helen Hunt Jackson pricked the moral sense of Americans in 1881 with A Century of Dishonor, which chronicled the sorry record of the government's ruthlessness and chicanery in dealing with the Indians. Also in Ramona in 1884, which was a love story about discrimination against the California Indians, which inspired sympathy for them. The debate seesawed. Humanitarians wanted to treat the Indians kindly and persuade them to walk the white man's road. The government policy was of assimilation. The hardliners insisted on the current policy of forced containment and brutal punishment. Neither side respected Native American culture or understood it, and Christian reformers often administered educational facilities on reservations. Sometimes they withheld food to force the Indians to give up tribal religions and assimilate into white society. In 1884, zealous white souls joined with the military to persuade the U.S. government to outlaw what was called the Sun Dance at the Battle of Wounded Knee. In 1880, when the Ghost Dance cult spread to the Dakota Sioux, the Army was afraid of it and bloodily stamped it out. In the fighting, an estimated 200 men, women, and children were killed, as well as 29 invading soldiers. This is a picture of the Lakotas receiving rations at the Standing Rock Reservation in 1881. The Dawes Several T Act was passed in 1887. This was a misbegotten offspring of the movement to reform Indian policy. It was reflecting the forced civilization of the view of reformers. The act dissolved many tribes as legal entities, wiped out their tribal ownership of the land, and set up individual Indian family heads with 160 free acres. If Indians behaved like good white settlers, then they would get a full title to the holdings as well as citizenship within 25 years. The former reservation land was not allotted to the Indians under the Dawes Act. It was sold to the railroads and white settlers, and with proceeds used by the federal government to educate and civilize the native peoples. The government-funded Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania was where Native American children were separated from their tribes, taught English, and inculcated with white values and customs. In 1890s, the government expanded its network of Indian boarding schools as well. They sent field matrons to the reservations to teach Native American women the art of sewing and to preach virtues of chastity and hygiene. The Dawes Act struck directly at the tribal organization. It tried to make rugged individualists out of the Indians and ignored their traditional reliance on Indian culture or tribally held land. By 1900, the Indians had lost 50% of the 156 million acres they held. The forced assimilation doctrine of the Dawes Act remained the cornerstone of government policy for decades. Indian Reorganization Act, or the Indian New Deal, came about in 1934. This partially reversed the individualistic approach and tried to restore the tribal basis of Indian life, and which we'll talk about in chapter 32 when we get there. The Indian population started to recover slowly as a result. The total number was reduced by 1887 to about 243,000, the results of bullets, bottles of alcohol, and bacteria. The census of 2000 counted more than 1.5 million Native Americans, both urban and rural. This is a picture of a Comanche village by George Catlin, 1834. This is a map showing the vanished lands, showing in the 1790s the amount of land that the Native Americans covered, and then slowly, following the Civil War into the 1880s and 1890s, and finally to 2000 today, you can see the amount of land Native Americans live on today. The conquest of Indians and the railroad were more life-giving boons to the mining frontier. The golden gravel of California continued to yield pay dirt. In 1858, an electrifying discovery convulsed in Colorado. Avid 59ers or Pikes Peakers rushed to the Rockies, but there were more miners than minerals. Many gold grubbers with Pikes Peak or bust inscribed on covered wagons going creaked back with busted, by gosh. Some stayed to strip away the silver deposits, and others stayed to farm grain. The 59ers, as they were called, also poured into Nevada in 1859. After a fabulous Comstock lode was discovered, the gold and silver was worth about $340 million mined by the kings of the Comstock from 1860 to 1890. This was in the scantily populated state of Nevada, which became the child of the Comstock lode. It prematurely railroaded into the Union in 1864, partly to provide 3 electoral votes for President Lincoln. Montana, Idaho, and the other western states, lucky strikes drew frantic gold and silver seekers. Boom towns, or helladors, sprouted out of the desert lands, and after every third cabin there was a saloon. The lynch law and vigilante justice tried to preserve crude semblance of order in these areas. When diggings petered out, gold seekers decamped, leaving the ghost towns behind, such as Virginia City in Nevada. They began with a boom, but these towns ended with a whimper. The age of business came to the mining industry. Impersonal corporations with costly machinery and trained engineers replaced former miners and mining. The once independent gold washer became just another day laborer. This is a picture of hydraulic mining in Nevada in 1866. The mining frontier played a vital role in conquering the continent. The magnet-like, it attacked the population and wealth while advertising the wonders of the Wild West. Women and men found opportunities running boarding houses or working as prostitutes, and with frontier equality, women won the right to vote in Wyoming in 1869, in Utah in 1870, in Colorado in 1893, in Idaho in 1896, long before the women in the East Coast, or near the East Coast, or in the East could vote. They amassed precious metals, which helped finance the Civil War, facilitated building railroads, intensified the bitter conflict between the whites and the Indians, enabled the Treasury to resume specie payments in 1879, and injected the silver issue into American politics. The mining frontier added to American folklore and literature from writers such as Bret Harte and Mark Twain. The problem of cattle marketing on the plains came along as beef bonanzas and the long drive became popular. The problem was how to get the cattle to market. This was solved by the transcontinental railroads, and cattle could now be shipped live to the stockyards. Under these beef barons, like Swift and the Armours, there were highly industrialized meatpacking businesses that were springing into existence as a main pillar of the economy. In gigantic stockyards in Kansas City and Chicago, meatpackers shipped fresh products to the East Coast in newly perfected refrigerator cars. The spectacular feeder of the new slaughterhouses was called the Long Drive, which you'll see in the map on 26.3. The Texas Cowboys, who were black, white, and Mexican, drove herds of 1,000 to 10,000 cattle over the unfenced and unpeopled plains to a railroad terminal. The beasts grazed en route on free government grass. Their favorite terminal points were fly-specked cow towns. The steer was king in the cattle kingdom, which was richly carpeted by grass. The lush grass made the long drive profitable. So from 1866 to 1888, more than 4 million cattle were moved by the long drive. The railroads made the long drive, and the railroads unmade the long drive as well. Some rails that bore cattle from the open range brought out homesteaders and sheep herders. Intruders became too numerous to be cut down by the cowboys. The terrible winter of 1886 to 1887 left thousands of cattle starving and freezing. The overexpansion and overgrazing took its toll as cowboys slowly gave way to plowboys. The only escape for the stockmen was to make cattle raising a big business and avoid the perils of overproduction. The breeders learned to fence their ranches and lay in winter feed, to import prize bulls and produce fewer and meatier animals, and to organize. Wyoming Stock Growers Association was created in 1880s, virtually controlling the state and its legislature. This was the heyday of the cowboys. Equipment of cowhands served useful purposes, and they could justifiably boast of their toughness. Bow-legged knights of the saddle became part of American folklore, and many cowboys were blacks who enjoyed the freedom of the open range. This is a picture, dressed to kill, showing cowboys in all varieties and sizes in the wild and woolly frontier west. This is map 26.3 that shows the cattle trails, and the long drive can be shown by the cattle trails starting out in Texas and then moving north along these lines to the different railroads and meatpacking places where they could be moved alive. The sober sodbuster won the final chapter of the frontier history. The Homestead Act in 1862 had allowed a settler to acquire as much as 160 acres of land by living on it for 5 years, improving it, and paying a nominal fee of about $30. This marked a drastic departure from previous policies. Before the act, public land had been sold for revenue. Now it was basically given away to encourage rapid filling of empty space and to provide stimuluses to family farms, which became the backbone of democracy. A godsend to farmers who could only afford to buy large holdings, many moved west. About 500,000 families took advantage of the Homestead Act to carve out new homes. Yet 5 times that many families purchased land from railroads, land companies, or states. The Homestead Act often turned out to be a cruel hoax. The standard 160 acres was frequently proved to be inadequate on the rain-scarce Great Plains, where it was difficult to farm, and thousands of homesteaders were oftentimes forced to give up the struggle against droughts. This is figure 26.1 showing homesteads from the public lands from 1870 all the way to 1940. The fraud spawned by the Homestead Act and similar laws made more land gained by speculators than actual farmers, and corporations used dummy homesteaders to grab the best properties. Settlers would swear that they had improved the property by erecting a 12 by 14 dwelling, which turned out to measure 12 by 14 inches. Railroads played a major role in developing the agricultural West. Largely through profitable marketing of crops, the railroad companies were induced induced Americans and European immigrants to buy cheap land. The sod busters built homes from the very sod they dug from the ground, and some pushed farther onto marginal lands beyond the 100th meridian. The area was separated by two climatological regions. One was well-watered area to the east, and the other was a semi-arid area to the west. Many went broke west of the 100th meridian. The dry farming eventually took root on the plains, which shallow cultivation was supposedly adapted to the arid west. Over time, dry farming created finely pulverized surface soil and contributed to the notorious Dust Bowl, which we'll talk about in Chapter 32, during the Great Depression. This is a picture of the average annual precipitation with major agricultural products circa 1900. Other adaptations to Western environments were more successful. Tough strains of wheat were imported from Russia. Wise farmers abandoned corn for sorghum and grains. Barbed wire, which was perfected by Joseph Glidden in 1874, solved the problem of building fences on treeless plains, and federally financed irrigation products caused the great American desert to bloom. Arching dams tamed the Missouri and the Columbia rivers, and 45 million acres irrigated 17 western states. Hydraulic engineers had more to do with shaping the modern West than all the trappers, miners, cavalrymen, and cowboys combined. You can see the myth and reality in the West, the percentage of federal lands within each state in 2004. The Great West experienced a fantastic surge in migration from the 1870s to the 1890s. The parade of new western states joined the Union. Colorado in 1876, in 1889 to 1890, 6 new states: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. And after the Mormon Church banned polygamy in 1890, Utah was admitted in 1896. Oklahoma is the name for the beautiful land, and scores of ogre-eager and well-armed Sooners illegally entered the Oklahoma Territory and had to be evicted repeatedly by federal troops. All was ready legally on April 22, 1889, and some 50,000 boomers were poised expectantly on the boundary line. At noon, the horde of 89ers poured in. That night, in the city of Guthrie, with more than 10,000 people, the city was born. In the end of 1889, Oklahoma boasted 60,000 inhabitants, and Congress made it a territory. In 1907, it became called the Sooner State. This is a picture of the Northwest Mounted Police showing the Act of Parliament in 1873, which established the Canadian Authority and order to bring order to the Northwest Territories. These are the Canadian Mounted Police, or called the Mounties. In 1890 is a watershed date because the frontier was fading. The superintendent of census announced for the first time in America's experience a frontier line was no longer discernible. The closing of the frontier inspired one of the most influential essays ever written about American history. Frederick Jackson Turner's The Significance of the Frontier in American History was written in 1893. The Secretary of War prophesied in 1827 that 500 years would be needed to fill the West. This is a picture called Working Women of the West, which shows how they worked, gathering buffalo chips in a wheelbarrow to be used for fuel on the Great Plains. The nation soon recognized that land was not inexhaustible. The actions were taken to preserve the vanishing resources, and the government set aside land for national parks. First Yellowstone in 1872, followed by Yosemite and Sequoia in 1890. The frontier was more than just a place. It was a state of mind and a symbol of opportunity. Its passing ended the romantic phase of the nation's internal development and created new economic and psychological problems. The frontier had always been a safety valve, and the theory that when hard times came, the unemployed who were cluttered in the city could move west, take up farming, and prosper. The truth about the safety valve was few city dwellers migrated to the frontier during the Depressions, and most didn't know how to farm, and few could raise enough money to transport themselves west and then pay for livestock and expensive machinery. It does have some validity, though. There was free acreage that lured to the west a host of immigrant farmers, and the very possibility of western migration may have induced urban employers to maintain wage rates high enough to discourage workers from leaving. The real safety valve by the late 19th century in cities like Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco was where failed farmers, busted miners, and displaced Easterners found ways to seek their fortunes. And after 1880, the area from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast was the most urbanized region in America. The Trans-Mississippi West formed a distinct chapter in the American history. Native Americans waged their last and most desperate struggle against colonization, and this is where most Native Americans live today. There the Anglo culture collided most directly with the Hispanic culture for dominance in the New World, and the Southwest remains the most Hispanic region in America. There Americans faced across the Pacific to Asia, and there most Asian Americans dwell today. The severity of the environment there posed its largest challenges to human abilities. Its aridity and still magical emptiness continues to mold social and political life. In no other region has the federal government, with its vast land holdings, its subsidies to railroads, and its massive irrigation projects, played so conspicuously a role in economic and social development. The mystical proportions in the American mind were immortalized by writers such as Bret Harte, Mark Twain, Helen Hunt Jackson, and Francis Parkman. Painters such as George Catlin, Frederick Remington, and Albert Bierstadt also painted the wide open spaces. For better or for worse, pioneers planted seeds of the American civilization in the immense western wilderness. The life we live, they dreamed of, and the life they lived, we can only dream about. And we'll talk about the agricultural revolution in part 2 of the review of this chapter.